I'm going to just use one lens, and it's a lens that many people have referred to. It's diversity. And Ashish Kothari just gave a really nice list of some of the ways in which diversity has been used through the discussions. And Suman Sahai also, I think you said that for you diversity is the key to sustainability in all its forms. So I want to make 3 points about diversity. The first one, and I hope that they help us unpick some of the emphasis we've given to it, is that diversity itself is diverse. Any given diversity can be appreciated and understood in a diversity of ways. So whether we're speaking, as we've done through the course of the 2 days, about users or stakeholders or geographies, environments, innovations, forms of decentralization, kinds of transition, the nexus, Melissa, when she said it at the beginning, spoke of a diversity of nexuses, political economies. All of these are diverse, but those diversities can be constituted. There's not just one in any given case. And so there is a danger then, I think, especially for those of us who really value equality, whatever it means, of apples coming up again, this time apple pie. Actually, that's an English phrase, isn't it? I don't know if that's... We only have one edible foodstuff in the UK, so we're very excited to call it apple pie. But of treating it as self-evident good, whatever it is. And I think then for those of us, and what's come out so strongly for me, and it's such a refreshing feature of this conference compared to a lot that you go to in Europe, is the explicit normativity, the commitment to social justice. So then, if that is a dominant commitment, we need to ask a question of diversity. What kinds, we need to deepen our understanding to what kinds of exclusions is diversity intended to resist? Because there are many kinds, it's not self-evident. So we're talking about nations, ethnicities, castes, classes, incomes, genders, ages, urban, rural locales. It's not enough to just question particular categories. Ask the question what job it is doing for particular kinds of exclusion, because there's all those kinds of exclusion in play in the very rich discussions we've had. And so something that really struck me from the discussions on the methods is how all the projects, the urban transitions, the uncertainty, the grassroots, the securitisation, all in different ways, recognising a point that's been made repeatedly. There are many kinds of below. There's not just one below, as Lila herself summarised very clearly. Using diverse methods of engagement to really address that. And I was quite impressed by I hadn't appreciated, I should have done, because I should know, but I hadn't appreciated just the richness of methods that are in place. But crucially, what is in common between all the projects is an aspiration, and certainly not one which anyone can claim to fully deliver on in any given instance, for doing research in a really grounded, engaged way, involving people themselves, insofar as it is possible to do, and really struggling to do so better. But crucially also, from my experience, again limited largely to Europe, North American settings, is engaging activists. Because that's so often, for academics, seen to be, engage people in invited, well-designed ways that Brian Wynne has written about, but activists, they're not objective, they have to be left to one side. And I was really struck by that feature of the work that's going on here. Clearly, in India, it's a very different matter. And I think that's a lesson we can take back into different settings. But also thinking more deeply about diversity means recognising that to a large extent diversity is in the eye of the beholder. There are different imaginations, understanding, knowledges around what actually diversity is. And this engagement with activists and with the people themselves in research is not, as I so often hear in other sustainability discourses, as objects to be understood better in a sort of enlightened fashion, but as subjects of the research, as partners, in the ways I've tried to say, because it's only that way one can understand the fine-grained detail of the different framings of things. So, for instance, of the nexus, it's easy to see, as is the case in the British debate, and we heard a bit about it here, that the key issues of the nexus between energy and food and water are the trade-offs between them. But actually what comes out when you engage with people themselves is you find the trade-offs are of course there and they're profoundly important. but it's the way these things are constituted, what we mean by them, that's really in tension, and how they constitute each other. So it really enriches, I think. So thinking then about one of the terminologies that we've tried to organise around in the STEPS Centre, pathways, there's a danger for us too, and I think that's a lesson I've really drawn out here, about reifying particular pathways. You know, what are the pathways that empower marginal people of particular kinds? What is the dominant pathway? Actually, it's quite difficult to singularise those things. And we need to think more. We've tried, but I think it's emerged by some of the discussion here, to think more about the relations between pathways, about repertoires, a word that's come up before, about how these things relate to each other, because that's really crucial. For instance, in the case of the urban project, this dichotomy of informal and formal is very important for raising questions, but actually in reality it's a much more complex and messy world. How can waste pickers actually relate in their own terms to the formal? How can the informal relate in its own terms to the formal? It's not about just trying to replace one with the other. I'm probably wrong in that point, but I hope I'm provocative. And another point is coherence, the flip side of diversity. A little bit less fashionable to people like me. But what is it that makes things sufficiently similar to be considered diverse in the first place? So for instance, it's not meaningful to think of a waste pickers cooperative as a response directly to food sovereignty. It'll have all sorts of relevance, but when one thinks in different ways about different settings, it's not self-evident what would count as things which might be then considered how diverse they are. So we need to think more explicitly about the kinds of ways in which things are coherent. What makes them salient? What makes given pathways or practices or kinds of innovation salient? And of course, and what coordinates them, stabilises them? We need to think about those kinds of qualities. And there again, this has come up in a number of ways in different areas. And I think the views that are most matter in that are not the views of the analysts looking in, but the views of the people themselves about what makes different practices and innovations salient. So, not only then is it diversity in the eyes of the beholder, but it's the links between the pathways themselves and what makes them relate to each other. Now that brings then a second point, a really crucial one to me, diversity and power. Both in terms of the diversities themselves, diversities of pathways, diversities of practices, but the way they're seen. How does power actually constitute these diversities in the world and constitute the views we take when we look at them? Because globally, it's far from clear that diversity is as progressive as you might judge. There are all sorts of ways in which diversity privileges incumbency, it reinforces it. It's an expedient fig leaf for reified marginalisation. Well, we have a look at our diverse culture. Privilege loves plurality. Elite cultures, private education, boutique healthcare, apartheid, to take an extreme example, colonial divide and rule, can all be presented with this fig leaf. So we need to think hard then about how the power relations work within diversity as well. And this has been mentioned strongly. Adrian Smith mentioned the OECD's approaches to social innovation and social technology. And it's clear that here, incumbent firms, I mean, it's a little experiment I've got. I go around looking at oil company annual reports. I don't think I've seen one yet in the last few years that doesn't have a wind turbine on the front. Celebration is conspicuous rhetoric of diversity used as a fig leaf to cloak somewhat less diverse patterns of investment and real resource flows. Likewise, the World Bank is. So we need to look beyond those rhetorical gestures towards diversity. So then I think there is a responsibility for those of us engaged in research, no matter how engaged we might think it is, not just to analyse power in these contexts, but to challenge it. Because knowledge itself, as we've heard, it's a very profound, I'm going to remember it, that knowledge is less equitable than capital. And that's the power relations embodied in knowledge make us interpret diversity in different ways. We have to not just try and analyse that, but challenge it actively as people engaged in knowledge production. So I think we mustn't be complacent about diversity. And one of the particular ways in which I've taken from here is the tension that popped up in approaches to pathways, whether we're looking about emancipation or at progressive involvement of excluded people by including in a pathway, or by opening up different pathways. Suhas Paranjape, I hope I pronounced the name, made a very interesting comment there about the tension between inclusion in formal structures, which reifies incumbent paths, and subsumes. It's the process of subsumption that was very nicely pointed out there. So a danger of including in is reifying the thing into which inclusion is taking place. But on the other hand, Lila Mehta drew out very nicely in comments on neoliberalism that the opening up also has pathologies, because you raise risks of romanticising coping strategies, and again, reify those. So that apparent dichotomy, including in or opening up, actually you have to really think about it in terms of these sorts of power dynamics around it. And likewise, in the grassroots project, Mariano talked about contrasting the relations between, different kinds of relations between the grassroots and the incumbents, and Dinesh brought this point up as well. So this is a real challenge around scaling up, is thinking about the relations under which, I'm going to go back to that point, under which that takes place. And I thought Adrian's move from thinking about appropriate technologies, as was the case in a European setting decades ago, to actually being deliberately inappropriate, to actually catalyse these complex dynamics, and actually the notion of the termite movements being inappropriate, I particularly like. So, there's not a simple opposition between opening up and including in. Maybe we should think of it more as a kind of ratchet. These non-linear processes, you ratchet, you include in when the circumstances are right, and you open up, and you think about these things as non-linear processes that you can actually try to exercise some agency to influence. And the third and final point I want to make then extends that, and it's really comes through in so many ways in our discussion about the role of diversity in transformation. Melissa at the beginning pointed out that we don't just wish in STEPS work to appreciate alternative pathways, but to help build them in various ways, just to help, otherwise it's too presumptuous. And Lawrence's point about it not just being about helping building pathways as innovation trajectories, but as transformations. So what then can be the role, and what are the pitfalls of diversity when we're thinking about these, this aim, this aspiration that I think is broadly shared, about transformation to a more emancipatory ways of innovating? Well, the first one, I think, is around, the only one really, is about scaling up and thinking hard about that. We heard about it, Krishna Rao made some very nice points about intermediate institutions. And in order to scale up, it's not enough to think about getting things right at the low level, at the ground level, on the ground in local settings, but at intermediary institutions that span and help learn and help extend practices and allow them to grow organically. But it's crucial, of course, when we think about these power relations, that those intermediate institutions and those practices and those bridging individuals take this responsibility to address power as a central part. It's not just to extend and scale up, it's to address and challenge power as well. Otherwise, the institutions will become an instrument of the incumbent power structures. The process of co-option that many people have referred to. And that's where I think the process of reflexivity comes in, which STS, which has popped up in discussion a lot, makes a lot of noise about. It speaks a lot about reflexivity, where apparently it's difficult to be committed in terms of knowledge, to say this is how things are, at the same time as being reflective. And actually I think one of the points that comes out in this discussion that we've had is to break down that idea. I think it is possible. In fact, not only is it possible to be reflexive and committed at the same time, arguably to be committed to a normative aim, to social justice, or to understanding the world as it is, even though you realise we'll never get there, is a crucial fulcrum for them being reflexive about how you can get different answers depending on how you look at that. And I think that's an important lesson also for some of our the disciplines that we're most, I, for instance, owe a biggest debt to. So, in thinking about scaling up then, I think we have to really critique the role of control. There's a huge pressure on people in our position, researchers, interested in exercising change in the world, as a sort of policy etiquette, to see like the state, to speak a language that somehow is appropriate. Even when we're critics, we're under pressure to do that, so the state can use that language. Assume there is such a thing as control. So we've become quite romantic about control. We speak about how we design processes for scaling up, as if the world moves in that kind of way. But I wonder, if we think about it, especially what kind of transformative change in the world has ever really been made by design and control. These things are much more dynamic, much more emergent, typically, and the more profound they are, the more that is the case, I would contend. So it's a challenge for critics and radicals, as well as it is for instrumental work, to be more critical about control and be more reflective. And I'm going to curtail what I say here, I think, and just go straight to the final point, which is that the kinds of specific recommendations, the concrete things that come out of our research, the processes, the practices, the institutions, the technologies that might look favourable, I think it's important to resist the temptation in the light of all I've just said, as the things out of which we directly build these transformative changes. It's tempting to do that, and sometimes that may be the case. I feel, and I've been really reinforcing this by the discussions we've had here, that these things are best regarded as ways to provoke the world, to give it a push, and the real potential for transformative change, especially emancipatory, radical emancipatory transformative change, is not by trying to design our way towards it, but by giving the world pushes in all these different ways, and thinking about the way that conditions the environment. And so when Deepak Giwali was talking about, well, in fact, one of the things, Deepak, you emphasised was democracy. And for me, in a diversity of ways, the most important feature of that conditioning environment, that wider environment, which these interventions, the technologies, the institutions, the organisations, the practices, can achieve things in relation to, is a wider conditioning environment we think of in very many ways, but could broadly be called democracy, as processes of struggle. So to add then to the responsibility to rethink development, rethink growth, I think we also should be rethinking a diversity of democracies as the environment within which these interventions can most productively take place. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy.